We are back. I've been busy and I apologize for not uploading for so long, but today we are doing a different type of video. You saw it in the title. I chose to give 7 Deadly Sins a second chance. I watched all of it, including all the movies in the right order, barely a couple weeks ago at this point actually. I've been posting pretty consistently on TikTok about it, so it is all very fresh in my mind. Now I should probably put a spoiler warning here, but before diving into my current thoughts on the series, I should probably preface this by saying that I watched all of it a couple years back, and frankly, I wasn't a big fan. I didn't watch the movies, but I did watch all 4 seasons and didn't really like it. So I'm gonna yap a bit on why that was the case first, so y'all can have a better basis of what may or may not have changed for me on the rewatch. Even before all of that though, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, all that good stuff, because we like anime and manga here, we like talking about anime and manga here, and we like talking about how much we like anime and manga here. And once again, I apologize for no uploads for a while. I've been dealing with some stuff and trying to get things on track, but hopefully, I am praying now, bunch of stuff on the drawing board, we will start uploading more regularly, hopefully weekly. Now, I have watched hundreds of anime at this point, and 7 Deadly Sins was pretty solidly sitting in the bottom 15, so you might be asking yourself,
Imran, why in the world would you subject yourself to 100 episodes of something you disliked so much? Are you stupid?
And the short answer is, I might be. But I am generally a completionist who tries to consume as much of something that's available to me as possible so I can try to pass as fair of judgment as possible, rather than just, parroting what other people say. And in the case of 7 Deadly Sins, the initial premise and general world-building aspect of it was genuinely interesting enough to me that I really did want to like it. So much so that I kept sticking with it, hoping that something would eventually change, and before I knew it, it was all over, and I was really just glad to be done. To give you an idea of some of my main gripes, I didn't like any of the sins, and it's kind of hard to enjoy a series where you despise the entirety of the main cast. King felt too whiny, Deanne felt like she contributed absolutely nothing, Meliodas was a serial groper every time he was on the screen. Even Escanor, who everybody praises to high heaven, felt so debilitatingly bipolar to me that his extreme cowardice in his regular form pretty much canceled out all the aura he could have had. Gother especially frustrated me to no end with his memory manipulation antics that just kept inconveniencing everyone and causing so many unnecessary and dragged out plot lines that I just never felt like he got punished hard enough for. And any of that development he got later on about his backstory and acquiring a heart and all that jazz just felt way too late after I'd already decided that I just didn't like him. Now, I actually kinda liked Bon, except I made the fatal mistake of expecting his whole story arc to revolve around getting over Elaine's death, especially, all the time he spent with Jericho, and how she was clearly in love with him. I felt like they could have built off of that. But then Elaine got revived and it all went to dust, and I just felt kinda weird and disappointed seeing him getting it on with what looked to be an 8-year-old. Merlin was pretty much the only one I had high hopes left for by the end, and then the whole chaos thing came out and confused the hell out of me, and just sort of ruined her character in my eyes. It just felt so late to pop something like that out of seemingly thin air. Aside from my gripes with the main characters though, I actually enjoyed season 1 for the most part, though I definitely put way too much stake in expecting the whole Framed by the Holy Knights plotline to last way longer than it did. So when that wrapped up, I didn't really have much of a vision for what the plot could do to move forward. All the lore dumps started feeling incredibly forced and convoluted, and somewhere along the way, I kind of just decided that I was watching to get it over with, so the comprehension was largely lost on me. In total, I got a story where more than half the plot just didn't make any sense whatsoever, and I didn't have a single individual character to latch onto in spite of it because I hated all of them. Then we got an ending with a being supposedly more than double the strength of the main villain just appearing for the first time in the last 3 episodes before immediately getting sealed away. And on top of that, you just sprinkle in a whole lot of weird stuff, and I just hated it, man. Now you're probably wondering,
Imran, if it was really that bad, why on earth would you watch it again? Are you stupid?
Well, this one is actually a really interesting case. See, what I neglected to mention is that due to sunk cost fallacy, I actually ended up moving on to the sequel for Knights of the Apocalypse, and dare I say, I quite liked it. Although after finishing the first 2 seasons, I never moved on to the manga, and as I said, it's been a couple years since then, so admittedly my memory has now grown very faded. However, more recently, I've actually had a growing fascination in Arthurian legend, and kind of a bit of fear of missing out. I've heard some hearsay here and there of later plot events in Four Knights of the Apocalypse, specifically in the manga, and it genuinely sounds kind of interesting. The only issue being that, well, I barely remembered anything from the original series or the first 2 seasons of Four Knights of the Apocalypse that I watched, so obviously, if I'm going to get interested and potentially start reading this manga, I gotta re-educate myself so, I can have all the world building and all the lore and all that stacked up in my mind. And once again, me coincidentally having a growing fascination in Arthurian legend and knowing that the entire world of Seven Deadly Sins is inspired by Arthurian legend, I figured, I have some time on my hands. Maybe, just maybe, I could try to watch this show again. Not only that, but I kind of managed to admit to myself that a lot of my gripes with the series from originally watching it came from preconceived expectations that weren't met, so that felt more so on me. Not to mention, I lacked a lot of comprehension because I sort of ignored the main lore. It also just has the vibes of the kind of series that will be really fun to make content for if I actually enjoyed it and understood more about it. And as I've grown over the years, I'd like to believe I've become a more open-minded person. I always thought the concepts in the show were cool, but I admittedly went in very entitled and got mad when they didn't play out the ways that I was expecting them to. So on a calm Saturday evening, when I should have been working on a final project for one of my classes due the very next day, I instead took a step back, opened Netflix, and launched episode 1 of Seven Deadly Sins. I went in not with a grudge, hoping or expecting it to be bad from my previous watch through, but instead genuinely trying to understand and appreciate Nakaba's vision for the story and the world that was created in it. Keeping an eye out for all of the foreshadowing and deeper themes and just trying to immerse myself as much as possible. And boy, oh boy, did that mentality pay off, because you remember how I said I didn't like any of the sins? Well, that's my gang! I am a fan of every single one of these guys, bro. In order from the bottom, I'd probably say Deanne is my least favorite at the moment. Not that I necessarily even dislike her, I just like the others even more. Her growth from being a young pacifist girl who hated fighting to then gaining the strength to be the strongest giant in history was sick. And obviously we had the whole thing with humans hating giants and seeing them as monsters, and she clearly had to deal with that. But just watching her resolve and not lashing out, even in the times that we clearly saw she had her doubts, made it so much more compelling. Because, you don't want to prove them as right, and seeing that shift from humans hating and fearing giants to then fully accepting them because of Deanne was lit. And generally, I'm not actually a huge fan of giant races in shows. I mean, I love One Piece, but I find the giants a little bit lame, so maybe I'm the racist one and that's why she's down here. Who knows? But you gotta love her, man. It's just so respectable. Next up, we got King, who's unfortunately a bit whiny from time to time, but his whole story with Deanne was adorable. And I'll be real, the dude had aura when he locked in for fights. Plus, a lot of his journey throughout the series felt like him navigating his insecurities of being a late bloomer as the Fairy King who didn't have his wings. So that was pretty cool to see. Not to mention, I especially loved his dynamics with characters like Bon, Halbram, and Gloxinia, the first Fairy King. Next, we have Escanor, which is going to sound insane to some people, but this is the start of the characters that I truly loved. Escanor is very much the hype moments and aura guy, and previously I know I mentioned that I just hated his cowardice, but really this time around I interpreted it as this timid dude who lacked the superhuman strength that you'd see on average in a fantasy universe, and just kind of trying to live in that world, dealing with these supernatural characters and monsters and living this life. I definitely think the contrast with that compared to his daytime form made for a pretty interesting dynamic, and I enjoyed that, I'll be real. Obviously in his daytime form, he's dropped multiple of the coldest lines in like all of anime history, and he really is that guy. But I do think in terms of overall character depth, compared to the other sins, he's probably sitting at like low-key the bottom. Not that I think you need to be like a super complex character to be a good character, but that's typically why I also felt if any of the sins had to die, it made the most sense to kill off Escanor to affect the story the least. And don't get me wrong, I very much shed a few tears, but it definitely wasn't a writing decision that I felt was questionable in any regard, as I would have if any of the others had met the same fate. Also, hot take, but him finding that bravery to fight in his nighttime form to protect Gilthunder and the others shortly before, he perished after losing his Grace of Sunshine, I think that might have been a top Escanor moment for me. Call me crazy, but I genuinely loved that. I respected the hell out of him in that moment. Now, Merlin, as I said earlier, was the only sin I had high hopes for by the end before it was all stripped away by Chaos, but this time around, since I was already aware of Chaos, I definitely paid attention to all the foreshadowing possible, and it was genuinely pretty interesting. I also just love how much of a genius she is when it comes to magic, and just seeing her outshine everybody else in that aspect was sick, combining different spells, creating new traps, all the variety we got to saw, and just overpowering characters as strong as even Chandler and Cusack, who previously, all the sins together got bodied by just Chandler. It was just sick, and I will never get tired of seeing how deep her bag goes. Honestly, strategists who generally lack physical strength but still manage to come out on top consistently is like one of my favorite archetypes. I love Shikamaru from Naruto, one of my favorite characters. And she was significant enough of a driving force in the plot to where it was consistently enjoyable, not to mention her true form being a child was really funny, I can't lie. This time around, her story and motives also made significantly more sense to me, to where by the time something like Chaos rolled around, it felt really cool rather than some random nonsensical shock. Next up, we got Gother, who definitely changed the most for me by far, because during my previous rewatch, he was easily my least favorite character in the entire series, to a point where it genuinely made the overall experience even worse just seeing him there. This time I still found his memory manipulation antics to be pretty annoying, especially when he messed with Gila and made her forget her own little brother Zeal, or when he erased Deanne's memories, which really just unnecessarily dragged out the whole conflict between her and King's relationship, in my eyes at least, considering both of their memories had already been messed with enough up to that point. It just felt like a really cheap way to keep dragging out that whole romance plotline between them, and I still, to this day, never feel like he truly got punished as much as I would have liked for those actions. I definitely tried my best to tolerate it as much as possible, especially considering his whole journey to understand human emotions and acquire a heart, and it was like kind of annoying still, but when we got to his backstory with Naja and everything that happened there, and him remembering how to feel emotions again finally, from that point on, he may as well have been a legitimately flawless character, like so much so to the point where it truly felt like Nakaba intentionally wrote him as an indirect apology for how insufferable he previously was. And I really just couldn't bring myself to hate anything about him from that point on, so I guess it evens out. Not to mention the original Gother was also the GOAT. Second place is Meliodas, and previously I actually really didn't like him, but this time around, after getting a better understanding of his relationship with Elizabeth, I was definitely able to tolerate his antics a bit more. Not that I was necessarily a fan of that kind of stuff, but I was able to look past it for how funny and cool he was otherwise, not to mention his backstory was insanely tragic, and really he feels like he has probably the most depth in the entire show. Obviously being the MC as well, just, naturally feeling more attached to him over time because he shows up more than anybody else and the story revolves around him more than anybody else. Last but not least though, we got Bond, the Fox Sin of Greed, as my absolute favorite sin. I just think emotionally he felt like by far the most relatable character out of the entire cast. I also loved his personality, his character development. I thought he had the most fun fighting style. I always love seeing me some good old hand-to-hand choreography, and seeing other characters' reactions to his magic never gets old. Also on the topic of his relationships with characters like Jericho and Elaine, I definitely this time around got a better feel for his brother-sister dynamic with Jericho, and it was pretty clear that it was just a one-sided, unrequited crush from Jericho's end, rather than any actual romantic development potentially blooming between them that I'd imagined the previous time around. Also, when it comes to Elaine, their relationship definitely fell in line with the actual legend of King Bon of Benwick and Lady Elaine being the parents of Lancelot, which is pretty consistent considering Lancelot's a key protag in the sequel Four Knights of the Apocalypse. I was definitely better accepting of her whole lolly archetype this time around too, considering the fact that not only are fairies in 99% of myths depicted as being somewhat childlike, but it's not like Bon was some kind of creep that fetishized her body or was really weird about it, so it felt fitting narratively. They built a genuine emotional connection, and I could accept that. Overall, though, aside from the sins in particular, the plot as a whole just felt so much more engaging, considering, this time around I definitely saw Season 1 as more of a prologue, leading up to the actual story and focus on the Holy War. Plus, with all the lore being introduced, the whole concept of the Holy War being built off of prejudice and pre-existing systemic bias between races, it definitely gave me a pretty good vibe about the story tackling an issue as prevalent as racism. I also realized that was obviously a really big part of the reason why all the sins were in mixed race relationships, which I think was executed incredibly well on that front. Now, when it comes to the villains, I thought the Ten Commandments were sick. Honestly, probably one of my favorite villain groups in anime so far. And Zeldris was incredible. I especially love his relationship with Gelda. That's probably my favorite relationship in the entire show. Zeldris just had incredible development as a whole. The whole Estarossa and Mael plot twist as well is probably one of the best, if not the best plot twist that I've seen in all of anime. Now, I did already know about this plot twist because, like I said, I've seen the show before, and this is one of the major plot points that stuck in my head for pretty obvious reasons. It's a big thing. But even just this time around, watching all the foreshadowing up to that point made it executed so insanely well. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of pure evil villains. I feel like they inherently lack a lot of depth unless they're really funny, like Frieza from Dragon Ball, for example. So the Demon King wasn't the most compelling big bad in my eyes, but I still enjoyed witnessing the events that were put into motion because of him, as well as the developing relationships between characters like Meliodas and Zeldris, especially as a result. I also watched the movie this time around, and it was kind of interesting, the Cursed by Light film, seeing the supreme deity not in the main episodic timeline or plot line, but I mean, the movie was very good. It was pretty entertaining, so I am glad they did go ahead and do something like that with her. I'll be honest, the first time around that I watched the series, I didn't even register that we didn't see the Supreme Deity, so yeah. At least there was something done. As for Chaos, in the end, I very much kept an eye out for all the foreshadowing possible, not to mention going in with the knowledge, this time around at least, that it was primarily meant to set up the sequel, Four Knights of the Apocalypse, rather than just some random thread at the end that gets to be sealed away as fast as possible. So that definitely quelled my annoyance from thinking it was some kind of random catastrophic entity that got dealt with in 3 episodes and never to be seen again. Not to mention Merlin's motives once again being way more clear this time around, with her trusting somebody as pure as Arthur to handle chaos, rather than just simply wanting to see destruction for some selfish interest. All of that said and done now, though, it is safe to say that I am officially an enjoyer of this series. And I am not afraid to admit that I was wrong in the past, and I have thankfully grown past all of that with a much better understanding of everything Seven Deadly Sins related. I think I've pretty much covered all the main talking points that I wanted to hit, and yes, I have rewatched the first 2 seasons of Four Knights of the Apocalypse as well, and I am currently making my way through the manga to catch up on it. Definitely one of my favorite mangas that I'm reading at this current moment. With all that said though, if you made it this far and enjoyed the video, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff to stay up to date. I apologize again for being gone for so long, but we are finally back and hopefully here to stay, and we're going to be trying out some new stuff on here. Also, feel free to follow me on TikTok and join my Discord server, both linked in the description down below. But other than that, I hope y'all have a blessed day, and I will catch you very soon.